presentation is aimed at informing people that are relatively new to the grant application process on writing a competitive grant application, not just writing a grant application. And there's a big difference, and we'll touch on some of those points here. We're going to discuss the keys to writing a competitive grant application. And I've been a reviewer for many years, so hopefully that'll come across in this and be informative. The first thing to consider when you undertake writing a competitive proposal, do you have the necessary skill set? Writing a competitive proposal requires grant writing skills and a lot more. It isn't just whether you understand a technology or have an invention or innovation that you think is valuable, but there's a great deal of skill in writing a competitive proposal. If you've never written a grant before, if you've never been mentored in grant writing, you're at a huge disadvantage and are unlikely to receive a favorable score that the agency will find fundable. The other kind of goes without saying, but you have to be able to make the necessary commitment of time and resources. I found in my grant writing, I've never spent less than 300 or 400 hours on a phase one, all things considered. All things in this case include background research, getting all your references lined up, and thoroughly understanding the topic area to the point that you can engage and convince reviewers. And we'll touch on that in a subsequent slide here. But it takes a tremendous amount of time and resources to write a competitive proposal. The first element, and it goes without saying, is a strong value proposition. There's really no hiding a weak value proposition. The value proposition, we can start with, what does the proposed innovation offer? What's so great about it? How can you make a case for it, a convincing case? What is the cost benefit? For example, a medical device. What does it cost? What does it benefit a hospital or patient or the healthcare system, managed care? What is the benefit to who? What does it cost? Is it, there has to be some favorable balance.
Jim, let me break in real quick on that one. On cost benefit, we occasionally get a client who is introducing something that the innovation is the cost benefit. I mean, the innovation rather is the cost savings. It's an efficiency sort of device. Do you consider that generally to be innovative enough?
Cost savings are a powerful argument for a value proposition. In and of itself, cost benefit is one of several elements. And if the only innovation is cost savings, it better be very clear and it better be a big one. Because you run the risk, if the cost benefit is really the key innovation, quote unquote, the innovation can easily be scored or regarded by reviewers as incremental. You haven't really discovered anything particularly great or new simply on cost benefit or cost savings, unless they're so tremendous. If you're cutting the cost of a common diagnostic procedure in half, that's very significant. And then you would have to make the case for that very convincingly. And you would need letters from experts in the field, not just the applicant saying this is going to save 50%. An outside expert in that field would need to say, yes, this is true. This would save 50% in a routine diagnostic test, for example. The next point is, what do experts think? What do outside experts think about the value proposition in a particular proposal? And experts' opinion is often difficult to get. The people who are an expert in a particular area of technology might be hesitant to take your phone call out of the blue, to write a letter of support, or something of that nature, or even to serve as a consultant. And even if you offer to pay them, they may be hesitant to get involved for all kinds of reasons. Maybe they just don't have time in their schedule. They're already working 80-hour weeks. But getting outside expert opinion on what you're doing is important for a lot of reasons. And one of them is they may bring up ideas or ask questions you hadn't thought of that reviewers will think of. And reviewers are basically your audience, your target for a proposal. And to wit, this comment, what do reviewers think? And that's ultimately the judge and jury of this whole process. And reviewers will take an objective opinion of your proposal and what they think is most important.
Jim, regarding the experts and the letters of support, some institutes that are part of the SBIR process are more favorable to letters of support than others. What's the ongoing perspective at the NIH on those?
You rarely see a competitive proposal that does not have outside experts involved in writing letters of support. Competitive proposals cover that base because it comes up so often. Unless an applicant has 20 years of experience in cancer research and has they make an outsized claim. For example, we have a new invention, whatever it is, a medication that will cure 50% of lung cancer patients. And I have 20 years of experience in the lung cancer drug development field. Unless you have a situation like that where it's extremely clear to reviewers that you do have that necessary expertise, as opposed to, I'm going to develop a new cancer treatment and I've been in the field for 2 years and I think this is a great idea, you're on shaky ground in review. And you would have to make your case, you'd have your case supported by outside experts, letters of support. Letters of support are very common in competitive proposals and uncommon in non-competitive proposals. Addressing the main aspects reviewers use to score your grant application. There are 5 principal scoring axes. Significance is a score driver, and that's reviewers' perception, their judgment, personal judgment of the significance of your innovation, your invention. And it involves a lot of things. It really is a conglomeration itself of many factors that are specific to each proposal. Each proposal is different in this regard. What about investigators? Well, investigators need to have demonstrated experience through their CVs, letters of support, their standing in their own field to be convincing. The investigators need to be experienced. New investigators will have trouble in review because reviewers will question whether you're capable of implementing a project if you're relatively new to it. So investigators' experience, the team that's going to take this on needs to have demonstrated expertise sufficient to convince reviewers that you can pull the project off. Innovation is a strong score driver. Perceived innovation, that is. Perceived by who? We're back to reviewers again. What do reviewers think about how innovative your proposal is, your idea, your invention? How innovative is it? Is it incremental? Is it a small step forward? Is it a huge step forward? Is it something completely new in a particular application area? So innovation is, again, a score driver and has to be very tactfully addressed in the application. Approach basically embodies how you're going to prove. Approach embodies the experimental methods, including the design of a clinical trial or clinical study, for example, the methods you use to determine the outcome, statistical analyses. All of those things are part of the approach score. Environment is typically not a score driver because experienced grant writers will include an environment statement of all the things they have available at their disposal, exclusive disposal, to implement the project. On the other hand, for new applicants who have never done an SBIR before, or a very small business composed of a couple of people, for example, their environment may be very weak. And a weak environment raises the question of, well, can you really do this project? But even if you have something tremendously innovative and it's very significant, if you don't have an environment to support the project and it isn't clear to reviewers, that can become a score driver where it otherwise would not be.
Jim, a couple questions for you regarding, let's say, investigators and also regarding environment. These 2 points could actually be met upon funding. Is that correct? So in other words, if somebody is not an employee yet, just as long as they're an employee by the time it's funded, that's okay? And same with the environment? Securing space by the time it's funded?
This is an important point, and new applicants or applicants with very limited resources, because they're basically in a startup mode, need to be very careful on how they phrase and format this element of the proposal. If you don't have an office, for example, that implies you really don't have the resources. And so that's a real catch-22 for new applicants. If a new application requires a very strong programming effort, software development effort, and you do not already employ a very experienced programmer, and you write in the application that you will find one, you're in a very weak position. That is likely to negatively impact the overall score of your application. And so it really is a catch-22 and has to be very carefully approached. A better way to handle this is to just include the biosketch or CV of a very experienced programmer and put them in the budget, and not mention that this person is not currently employed by, but you will need to identify that person in the application rather than saying, we will find a very competent programmer. You need to find a competent programmer first and get their CV and include them as an employee, as if they were an employee, is a better strategy than saying, we will find a very experienced programmer. Impact is the overall score of your proposal that will determine whether you get funded. And impact scores range from 1 to 9, with a 1 being close to perfect. I think they use the word outstanding, but impact is a complex construct to embrace, especially for new applicants. Impact is the reviewer's judgment of what the real world significance or value of your innovation is. If you successfully implement the project, what real world impact will result? How many patients, or how of what particular diagnosis or some other facet of your value proposition? How impactful is this really? The impact score, importantly, is not a simple numerical average of the 5 axes above. It is a construct. It's a concept. Reviewers are counseled very carefully by the scientific review officers at the Center for Scientific Review, which is responsible for reviewing proposals, on the impact score and what it is and is not. Regardless of how much counseling they get, however, a lot of reviewers have their own idea about what an impact score is, and it is a subjective judgment at the end of the day. What about scientific merit and scientific rigor? Well, these are 2 concepts that have been introduced in the last 5 years at the behest of the Health and Human Services Agency, because they like to see scientific merit and scientific rigor both. Is your project meritorious? And that can be defined in many different ways. Is it rigorous? Do you follow established practices accepted in the world of science to implement your project? Again, reviewers will make up their own mind about whether your project has substantial merit and rigor. And this does factor into the impact score, even though scientific merit and rigor are not items on the scoring sheet, for example, that's in front of a reviewer during a review. They're very important aspects to cover in your application. In a phase 1 application, there is no section for commercial potential. However, reviewers fully expect that you will cover this and you will make the case for the commercial potential of the innovation that you're proposing. And even though there's no section for this, you have to find a way to work it into the application in various places, in various ways, and it requires real skill to do that. A lot of times, experienced applicants will use the quote-unquote extra space in the specific aims page to describe what they're going to do in a phase 2 and make sure that this dovetails or overlaps with this concept of commercial potential of the device or invention.
I could certainly see opportunity where the impact score can range a bit away from where they were scored in the 5 criteria. At times, if there's lacking in the merit or commercialization potential, for example.
Scientific merit and rigor are not score drivers in and of themselves. However, reviewers will comment on them, and if your proposal is not scientifically meritorious and your methods are not rigorous, it raises other questions and can become an issue in review. Reviewers in discussion of the proposal can raise this if it's not sufficiently addressed and clear in the proposal. Writing for reviewers. The 2 main goals of writing an application, overarching goals, are to engage and convince reviewers. And by engage, I mean you have to capture their interest. And you do that starting with the project summary or abstract, in which you summarize in a very condensed way. And you only have 30 lines to do that, and you outline the entire project. That is the starting point for engaging reviewers with something interesting. And you also need to convince them. The proposal has to convince them that this is a valuable project, that you're capable of implementing it, and that you have all of the bases covered. So you have to engage and convince. And that's a skill that's a skill set that's not common. And if you're new to the grant writing game, you're at a huge disadvantage in this regard. You have to make your most important points stand out, and there's also tremendous skill in this. You can't overstate, but you also don't want to understate. And hitting the right note with reviewers is absolutely critical in this regard. Writing style is very important. And if you talk to people at NIH, for example, they'll say, well, writing style is, not something that we really regard as critical to getting funded. And I heard a representative NIH say one time, we don't really care that much about your writing style as we do the value proposition of a proposal. But reviewers care about the writing style a great deal. Reviewers are used to seeing very skilled writing, very tight, compact, clear, coherent writing. And so reviewers, when they see an application that's not written well, not written in a style they're used to seeing, it raises questions about the competence of the applicant that otherwise would not be raised. So writing style is very important. Backing up assertions made in the initial sections of a proposal. So in the start of a proposal, you have the abstract and summary, and then you have specific aims. In the specific aims, you lay out the specific things you're going to do. You make claims about how valuable the innovation is and what you're going to do. And all those assertions need to be backed up in the initial sections. And this seems to go would go without saying, but it's surprising how often this is not done, and not done well enough to convince reviewers that you are going to successfully implement the project that you've described. What about tables and figures? Tables and figures are powerful in that they're easy for reviewers to digest. And sometimes a figure can sell a project, especially, there's the old saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And graphics and illustrations and proposals can be very powerful. The problem with them is that they take space. And you'll find in writing a proposal in which you're limited to 6 pages that the 6 pages goes by very fast. And it's often the case when I write proposals, I end up with 7.5 or 8 pages of content that I regard as very valuable. And so you have to be careful with tables and figures of whether they're really necessary, and how much of your other valuable text will have to be excluded or somehow condensed to meet the page limit. So that's a real catch-22.
Certainly sounds like with all the work that certain figures and illustrations can take, even tables, it would be best to perhaps put that effort in at the end after you finish writing, if you believe you could actually fit those in, warranted they're going to be helping your proposal.
I would counsel new grant writers, relatively inexperienced grant writers, on this topic in the way I approach it. I write down everything of importance to a project first, and I don't worry about the page limit. I write down everything that I think is valuable, and then I start condensing and tightening the proposal to meet the page limit. And tables and figures are so valuable, and it's nice to have them. And one of the kind of secrets of including a table in an SBIR is you don't have to meet the font size limit. And savvy grant writers have discovered that their proposal does not get rejected if they use a much smaller font than is otherwise allowed in a table. So you can compact a lot of information if you're skilled enough in the configuration of that table.
Right, right.
It's dangerous to assume that reviewers will spend a lot of time to understand a complex proposal. Reviewers are mostly academics who are extremely busy and serve on these study sections or review committees for various reasons. It's something to add to their CV, and it's an honor to serve on a review committee. However, they're very busy people, and if you write a complex proposal that's not extremely well written and doesn't flow in a certain way that they're used to seeing, don't assume that they're going to look up references or go to any extra effort to understand your application. Everything within an application that you put in there has to be self-explanatory. Reviewers are advised that they are not obligated in any way to look up references. So if you make an outsized claim, for example, and I've seen this many times, and an applicant will cite 4 or 5 publications that support an outsized claim or assertion of some kind. I've actually gone to some of those that I think are unlikely to be true and found that they're not true. An applicant makes a claim, and then they, in parentheses, they give 3 or 4 or 5 references to back that up. I've gone to the references, and they don't back it up. And I bring that up in review. And but most reviewers will not go to great lengths to research the background of your proposal. Assume that they'll spend a minimal amount of time so they can set your proposal aside and get on to the next one, because they get a stack of proposals to review. This is a series of comments from a recent presentation given by a representative of the Center for Scientific Review, an SRO, a scientific review officer. And she was kind enough to share with me And these are some of the things that, from her perspective, that are common problems in applications. And one of these, the first gets back to how innovative is the invention or development in your application. The scientific rationale needs to be clear and strong. A lack of experience in essential methodology, needless to say, going back to approach, is absolutely critical. A lack of such is a negative score driver in a big way. Questionable reasoning and experimental approach goes without saying. An uncritical approach. Reviewers like to see some self-critique or questioning. Reviewers don't want you to try to over-impress them with how great your innovation is or make outsized claims that can't be supported. And in this comment on uncritical approach, they also like to see some semblance, some element of questioning from your own side, questions that you will answer or address in the application. So when you write the significance or background section of a proposal, you discuss the various aspects of your project and raise some questions and show that you have an understanding, sufficient understanding of the field you're in to ask critical questions. Diffuse, superficial, or unfocused research plan, needless to say, is a big problem in review. Lack of sufficient experimental detail. You need to explain your methods clearly. Often people have asked me, geez, how can you include a lot of detail for all the things that need to be within a 6-page limit? And this comes back to grant writing skill, how to compress and condense and include only those elements that are absolutely essential for reviewers to see. And I've seen proposals go through cycles of review where reviewers will ask for additional detail on methods. And in a revised application, you can include additional detail. You can edit out that last comment. Lack of knowledge of published or relevant work is a real flag for reviewers, a red flag, if you will. Not knowing much about the field you're in is a problem. You can edit out that last comment. Lack of knowledge of published relevant work is often evidenced in the number of references you include in the bibliography section of your application. An application that has fewer than 20 references or so, for me as a reviewer personally, is a flag. Competitive proposals that I routinely review commonly have over 50 references. And it doesn't have to do just with the methods or technological details. It has to do with the background of the topic area itself. And for you to reference a lot of papers that support the background and set the stage for your proposal is absolutely critical. Unrealistically large amount of work. Well, what is unrealistic? Well, in whose eyes? Well, in reviewers' eyes again. But I'll tell you that most experienced grant writers and the most successful grant writers that I've known over the years tend to overpromise in a phase one rather than underpromise. And there's a fine line here, or maybe multiple lines, to not cross or cross and do it very skillfully. And this is, again, comes back to grant writing experience. Better to overpromise in a phase one than underpromise. Uncertainty concerning future directions really points to the commercial potential. Where is this all going? What will be the impact of it? Impact score, future direction. Where is this going? How impactful will it be in the real world?
Now, Jim, most of those points, more established researchers would have a greater capability of meeting those. A lot of applicants that come to ScienceDocs for help with these grants oftentimes might have more of a scant scientific background, if any. They're more of an entrepreneur than they are certainly a scientist. And they're lacking in many of these points quite often. So I'm glad you showed this particular slide. It's certainly worth dwelling on a bit.
Well, I'd like to comment because I think you point to a very common situation that where an applicant is an experienced entrepreneur, but for example, has few or no scientific publications. And even though the guidelines for SBIR applications don't require an applicant to have scientific credentials, reviewers fully expect that.
Hmm.
And a principal investigator, the lead of an SBIR application, is fully expected to have a very impressive CV or biosketch. And I've seen applicants that have a lot of industry experience, but very, very little scientific experience. In this case, I would advise applicants to engage one or more established scientists in their field of expertise to bolster the team. Without experienced scientists in the team, even though an SBIR is about product development, first and foremost, the science that underlies it, the science that supports it is critical, and not having a team that includes scientists with serious experience is a major negative score driver.
And by team, you're talking about a co-PI here.
No, not necessarily a co-PI. They can be a consultant. And in another ScienceDocs presentation, we'll talk more about the value of having an advisory committee of experts who are essentially act as consultants, but whose CVs, biosketches are included with your application. So a PI can position themselves as an expert in a technology and say, and my weak experience as a scientist is supported, bolstered by an advisory committee of people who are experts, who do have 15 to 20 years of experience in a particular field. And that's a very powerful approach, and it's very common in competitive applications.
Nice point, Jim.
Additional points, we just touched on this, university-based collaborators and advisors. It cannot be overstated. You cannot overstate the importance of having university-based people with serious credentials in your field as collaborators and project advisors. One of the reasons is that reviewers understand that unexpected things happen in projects. Surprises come up, unexpected and unwelcome surprises. And dealing with problems that come up in the middle of a project requires deep experience. And an applicant who is not backed up by an expert in the field that they're developing in is at a serious disadvantage in review, let alone if they get funded. The importance of an affiliated, experienced grant writer editor can't be overstated. If you have little or no grant writing experience, you will need to affiliate with, connect with an expert. There are so many strategies and tactics that experienced successful grant writers utilize, and you don't want to try to learn those things by experience and submitting an application as a first-time or relatively inexperienced grant writer. Reviewers will see through that and will regard it as a serious weakness, and it will trigger them to look for other flaws in the application. And that's a path to a poor score. What about a second pair of eyes? Even the most experienced grant writers that I know, including myself, really need a second pair of eyes to review a proposal, not just for typos. A word processor will pick up typos and things like this. But the number of times that I've written a proposal and spent 300 plus hours on it, that I go back and reread it 2 weeks before a deadline and see things that are completely out of position or paragraphs that are poorly stated, I couldn't count. Even the most experienced grant writers that I know say they would like to, if they have the luxury of time, write a grant proposal put it in their desk for 3 months, and then take it out and read it again, and often come away with the comment, geez, I have no idea who wrote some of that. It doesn't look familiar at all. So
Yeah.
a second pair of eyes on a proposal is valuable, especially in the last weeks before the application deadline. And this is a service that ScienceDocs also can provide.
Yeah, you mentioned the luxury of time, and I have to say, we get new clients every day, and I've seen a lot of countless cases, and I've never come across somebody who has the luxury of time, whether that be an active researcher at a university or an entrepreneur who's going after his or her first grant or X grant. Time is never really something that they have much of, and oftentimes they are wearing multiple hats and just trying to do way too much at once. So it becomes a really big factor in why I think clients are coming to us.
Well, your point dovetails nicely with this bullet point. So having an expert not only to identify flaws in your application, but also to raise questions and to save you a lot of time to see things in a different way, so that you don't go down the wrong avenue, so to speak, and spend a great deal of your own time on something that's unlikely to be successful.
All right, Jim. I think that about wraps us up for this particular episode. Appreciate all of these wonderful points. And we're going to do a question and answer version either on LinkedIn or YouTube or on the ScienceDocs website, so that we can eventually get to any questions you have about this material. There are going to be many other webinars, so we will certainly address various points along the way. But if you have any questions, feel free to pipe in. Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome.